Hey guys, tonight we're diving into what sleep really looked like during the Middle Ages. Not the kind of sleep you and I know, but the kind broken by cold wind, creaking timber, and the odd farm animals snoring nearby. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. In the medieval world, especially in rural England, the concept of a full 8 hours of uninterrupted rest was foreign. People slept in shifts, sometimes without realizing that's what they were. Doing the peasant's hut, simple, cramped, and shared by the entire family, was not a place of peace and quiet. It was a place of survival. Let's take you inside a modest timber-framed hut in the year 1310. The thatched roof sags slightly from the last heavy rain, and smoke from the central hearth curls slowly through a small opening near the rafters. The room smells of ash, old straw, and the faint sourness of stored cabbage. A mother is curled up with 2 of her children under a patched woolen blanket. Her husband lies opposite, near the hearthstone, so he can tend to the fire during the coldest part of the night. A baby stirs in a straw-lined basket, but they are not all fully asleep. Not at the same time. In the world before artificial light, night was not one long stretch of sleep. Instead, many people experienced what historians call segmented sleep. There was a first sleep from dusk until sometime past midnight, followed by a quiet waking period, then a second sleep that would last until dawn. What did people do during that waking hour? In towns and manors, they might pray. In villages, they might check on animals, tend the hearth, mend clothing by candlelight, or, for some, even slip outside to visit neighbors. It was a liminal time, hovering between dreams and reality, when the line between waking and sleep was blurred. The peasant family had their own rhythm. In the first sleep, the children often settled first, huddled close together for warmth. The adults might stay up a little longer, talking softly or quietly sewing in the firelight. Then, once everyone was down, the fire banked low but still glowing, came the deep, heavy part of rest. But by midnight or slightly after, someone would always stir. It was practical. Fires needed tending, or the cold would creep into the bones. A cow might be calving in the shed. Rain might leak through the thatch. Or simply, someone needed to relieve themselves in the dark. This was the midnight watch, a silent responsibility, usually rotated between adult members of the household, where someone remained lightly awake to listen. For what? For wolves, for thieves, for a creaking sound that might mean the roof was shifting under wet weight. They were not always fully alert, but they were never fully unconscious either. Even the structure of the hut encouraged wakefulness. There were no doors that locked, just wooden latches and makeshift bars. The chickens might sleep in a small coop inside the hut itself, providing body heat but also scratching and clucking in the night. Outside, the world was not still. There were no city lights to drown out the moon. You could hear the owls calling, the faraway bark of a dog, or worse, the quiet crunch of someone's footsteps on old leaves. And so, even as people laid down to rest, their ears remained half-tuned to the sounds of threat. And yet, for the peasants, this broken sleep was not unnatural. It was the rhythm of life, a pattern dictated by necessity, climate, and the absence of modern convenience. In many cases, waking in the middle of the night offered a rare moment of solitude, a chance to stretch, stir the fire, maybe even whisper a prayer in the silence. We often imagine sleep in medieval times as miserable, but that's not entirely fair. Yes, the floors were hard, the air cold, and the pests persistent. But peasants adapted. Beds were made of wooden frames or even simple pallets on the dirt. On these, they laid sacks of straw, furs, or old blankets, whatever could be gathered. Over time, sleeping arrangements became strategic. Sleep with your feet closest to the fire. Children sleep together for warmth. And never let your head rest under the drafty part of the roof. Sleepwear. Not quite pajamas. Most people slept in the same undergarments they wore during the day. Sometimes nothing at all, just cloaked in furs or cloth. The idea of changing for bed was a luxury only the wealthy could entertain. And while the gentry might have feather mattresses, the peasant knew every inch of their straw pile. They'd fluff it, rotate it, and refill it when the bugs got too bothersome. But the biggest difference between then and now wasn't the mattress or the temperature. It was the acceptance of broken rest. Whereas we now stress over a perfect night's sleep, medieval folk expected interruption. They built their lives around it. They found a strange kind of peace in these intervals, a time to think, to notice the world, to check in with the body. And this leads to a fascinating thought. ... If you were used to waking in the middle of the night, not startled, but calm, what would that do to the way you dreamed? What might you remember more clearly? And what happened in that dark, quiet hour that didn't make it into the chronicles of history? Could the real secret of peasant survival lie not just in their work, but in the way they rested? The second sleep, a strange phrase to modern ears, but once a regular part of everyday life. After that short period of waking during the middle of the night, the hour of the midnight watch, many medieval peasants would drift into what they knew as their second sleep. And while the first sleep was often heavy and dreamless from exhaustion, the second one was lighter, more prone to vivid dreams and restless turning. In this section, we'll walk deeper into the nighttime rhythms of the medieval peasant, the architecture that shaped their rest, the unspoken rules of shared beds, and the small rituals that quietly kept the household alive from dusk to dawn. Let's return to our simple hut in the year 1310. The fire has been tended. The coals glow low and red. Outside, a slow frost begins to form across the cold, beaten earth. One of the children stirs, not because of fear, but from habit. She turns, tucks her feet tighter under the shared woolen cloth, and fades again into sleep. The mother, having risen to check the roof's corner for leaks, lies back down and sighs. The sound of breathing, 5 different patterns in one room, fills the space like wind through a forest. This second sleep, you see, was not just a passive return to dreams. It was often the most useful kind of rest. People believed they would wake from it more refreshed, more inspired. Monks wrote that it was during this time that visions might come. In folklore, dreams during second sleep were more likely to be prophetic. Even medical texts of the time reference the idea of 2 sleeps. Medieval physicians believed that digestion followed a rhythm, and it was best to rise briefly between these cycles of rest to help the humors settle and blood circulate. For the peasant, it may not have been scientific, but it was tradition passed down through generations. You might imagine that sleep in a shared hut was chaotic, children crying, people shifting, but in truth, these families developed an almost wordless choreography. A mother knew by sound alone when her youngest was dreaming lightly. The father knew how many minutes it took to bank the fire just so. Even the dog curled by the door had its role, keeping heat in and warning of any strangers approaching. And it wasn't just humans in that room. Fleas and lice were ever present. Pests weren't a nuisance. they were expected. Peasants dealt with them in practical ways, changing straw often, burning herbs like wormwood or rue, and washing, when possible, in cold stream water. Bathing wasn't frequent, but that didn't mean it was ignored entirely. Evenings before bed were sometimes used for small tasks. Women might card wool, children would clean the floor with rushes, and any spare candlelight was saved for tasks that couldn't wait. Often, bedtime wasn't a firm rule. People dozed when they could, rose when needed, and let the night unfold as it wished. This kind of sleep, fragmented, communal, responsive, was deeply tied to seasonal rhythms. In winter, nights were long. A peasant might spend 12 to 14 hours indoors, with only the hearth for light. First sleep might begin soon after dusk, but in summer, with longer days and more field work, rest came late, and sometimes in shorter bursts, and when it rained. Rain transformed everything. Thatched roofs were imperfect. Some were coated in daub turfs, others reinforced with reeds. But water almost always found a way in. Pots and cloths were placed strategically. Families shifted beds around leaks. Sleep might be spent listening to the slow drip of water into a wooden bowl. There's a kind of resilience in that, the ability to adapt to discomfort without complaint. Perhaps that was the truest hallmark of the medieval peasant. Acceptance without surrender. They didn't resist the night. They learned to live with it. Some households, if they had older children, might assign turns for the midnight tending, a role passed down as a rite of growing up. For girls, it was often part of becoming the future manager of a home. For boys, it was their first experience of responsibility, and occasionally, in the deep quiet of that second sleep, the unexpected happened. A knock on the door, not a loud bang, just the light tap-tap of someone seeking shelter, a traveler, a neighbor in need, or perhaps the local reeve, bringing news from the manor lord. In such times, the peasant's night became a vigil. They would rise, light a small fire again, and offer a place near the warmth, never questioning why. Because in the countryside, hospitality wasn't just kindness. It was survival insurance. You help now, and you might be helped later. Especially in the dead of winter, when sleep could become too deep, and cold too deadly. Now, in our modern world, we rarely think of sleep as an active thing. Something you participate in, maintain, defend. But for medieval peasants, it was one more task in the long list of daily chores. You didn't just fall asleep, you tended sleep. Like the fire, like the animals, like the children. You listened to the wind. You adjusted the straw. You turned your body to avoid the draft. You let your mind wander in the waking hour, and then welcomed the second sleep with quiet grace. This way of life, this fragmented, watchful, strangely poetic way of resting, didn't disappear overnight. It lasted well into the early modern period. Some rural communities kept a rhythm even into the 19th century. But eventually, gaslighting, factory schedules, and clocks changed everything. Sleep became standardized, and yet, sometimes, when we wake in the middle of the night, not from stress, but for no reason at all, maybe we're echoing an older pattern, one built into us by centuries of firelight, cold air, and the soft creak of a timber roof. Is it possible that we haven't lost the second sleep? Maybe. We've just forgotten to listen for it. The rooster hasn't crowed yet, but there's a stirring inside the hut. The mother shifts beneath the covers, rubbing warmth back into her fingers. A child coughs lightly and turns over. The dog, still, curled near the door, lifts its head for just a moment. A few faint embers pulse in the hearth, casting a soft reddish glow. This is the final hour before dawn. Not quite the end of the second sleep, but close. A time when dreams often took strange turns, when the body rested deeply but the mind sometimes wandered. In this last section, we'll gently explore how medieval peasants awoke, how they prepared for the day ahead, and what sleep meant in the wider rhythm of their survival, physically, spiritually, and socially. Sleep was not separate from life in the Middle Ages. It wasn't isolated from chores, whether prayer or hunger. It was woven tightly into them all. Most peasants would wake not by alarm, but by habit. The smells of morning cold air, smoke returning to the chimney, damp straw, signaled the change in time. If they were lucky, someone had woken early to rekindle the fire. The hearth was the heart of the house. Without it, nothing could begin. In the quiet of these early moments, peasants might stretch, shift, or speak softly, not loudly. The body took time to warm. There were no rushes of caffeine or blaring clocks, just small movements, like sunlight, slowly reaching across a floor before leaving the bed. Many would offer a whispered prayer, not from luxury or choice, but as ritual. Sleep in the medieval mind wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. To sleep was to enter a vulnerable state. Dreams could be divine. Waking was, in some sense, a return, a small, daily resurrection. This connection between faith and rest was deeply embedded. The Church taught that sleep must not become sloth, but it was also seen as a gift. Some saints were said to receive visions while they slept. Others warned of the devil's work in dreams. Either way, the idea that sleep had meaning was widely accepted. As the family rose, one by one, the room would fill with gentle noises, the rustling of straw, the folding of rough woolen cloth, the clearing of a throat, the soft splash of water. In a wooden basin, water, if it wasn't frozen, would be used to splash the face, not in luxury, simply to wake the skin. Teeth weren't brushed, but sometimes cleaned with ash or chewed twigs. Hair was roughly combed by fingers or, if available, a shared wooden comb. And then, of course, there was food or the hope of it. Breakfast, for a medieval peasant, wasn't guaranteed. Sometimes, the first meal wouldn't come until mid-morning. In the fields, but if anything was eaten early, it was often a bit of yesterday's bread, soaked in warm ale, or weak pottage, thickened water, perhaps with a scrap of barley or leftover greens. All of this waking, eating, praying took place in the same space where sleep had just ended. The hut was many things at once: bedroom, kitchen, barn, and hallway. There was no such thing as privacy in the modern sense. Life was lived together, openly, and with a certain quiet acceptance as the sun crested the horizon, casting pale yellow light over the rough beams and wattle walls. Sleep faded entirely. The second sleep ended, not with a sharp break, but with a gentle dissolve. The day had begun. But here's where we return to our theme. Not just how they woke, but how they thought about rest. For peasants, sleep was a tool. It was how they preserved strength. They couldn't afford to stay up late or lie awake with worries. They had no time to romanticize insomnia. If you didn't sleep, you couldn't work. And if you couldn't work, you couldn't eat. Even in sickness, sleep was treated as medicine. Healers advised more rest for fevers, more blankets for chills, and prayers for disturbed dreams. Sleep was often the only remedy available. Interestingly, peasants did sometimes talk about dreams. Though they lacked formal psychology, they still made meaning from what they saw behind their eyelids. A dream of falling might signal danger. A dream of bread could be a sign of hope. These interpretations were passed through family lines, shaped by superstition, religion, and sheer necessity. And what about nightmares? They were common. Sleeping in shared rooms meant that one person's terror could wake the entire hut. The old hag, a sleep demon that pressed down on the chest, was a well-known explanation for sleep paralysis. Some even tied iron near the bed or placed protective herbs under pillows. But again, the peasant mindset was practical. Bad dreams were unwelcome, yes, but they were part of the night. Just like the cold, just like the fleas, just like the wind moaning through the thatch, everything was endured, and everything had its place. As we leave this little hut, warmed now by morning light, and stirred by the voices of a family beginning their chores, we should remember that this quiet, unspectacular story of medieval sleep reflects something much deeper. In a time when survival was uncertain, when illness and war and hunger loomed, the nightly return to rest was a small act of resistance, a way to say, I am still here, I will rise again, and maybe, when we wake up in our own quiet rooms, hearing the distant hum of a fan or the soft click of a heater, we're not so far from them after all. After all, who among us hasn't stirred in the darkness, blinked once, and wondered, should I go back to sleep? There's a stillness to the medieval countryside at night, a stillness broken only by the occasional distant howl of a dog or the creak of timber in the cold. But behind that calm, sleep was not the same everywhere. Some laid their heads on straw in open lofts, others curled beside the dying fire. A few, the lucky few, settled under wool covers in rooms with real doors. This is the story of where people slept in the Middle Ages, and how those sleeping places reveal more than we might expect about class, comfort, and the quiet dignity of rest. Imagine first the peasant family, the backbone of medieval society. Their entire home might consist of a single room, shared by both people and livestock. At one end, you'd find the hearth, the central source of heat, light, and cooking. At the other, a rough partition or raised area served as the sleeping space. There were no beds as we know them. Instead, layers of straw spread across the floor or stuffed into cloth sacks made a simple mattress called a pallet. If a family had even one actual wooden bed frame, it was passed down through generations, repaired, patched, but treasured. Children often slept together on shared bedding, sometimes near the door for warmth, or next to animals for extra heat. Privacy wasn't expected. Comfort came from closeness, not space. And while that sounds rough to modern ears, it was what people knew and they adapted. Fleas were common. Itching was part of bedtime. Blankets, if available, were made of rough wool or linen, often shared by the entire family. Some even used cloaks as covers, but not all peasants slept indoors. During the warmer months, especially during harvest or haymaking, many would sleep outside in haylofts, in barns, even under carts. A pile of fresh hay wasn't just warm, it smelled sweet and masked other less pleasant odors. In many ways, a hayloft was the peasant's version of a guest room, simple, breathable, and quiet. Now, let's rise just one small step up the social ladder to the craftspeople and townsfolk. In medieval towns, houses were more vertical, narrow, and stacked. The ground floor might serve as a shop or storage. The family lived above, in a room or two cramped with beds, chests, and tools. Beds here were still shared. A married couple would take the main bed, sometimes with a child or two tucked in alongside. Apprentices and servants slept on benches, in corners, or under stairwells. Privacy remained rare. Curtains or cloth hangings were the closest thing to walls. Interestingly, bed sharing wasn't always about necessity. It was also seen as normal social behavior. Travelers frequently shared beds with strangers at inns. Monks shared dormitories. Even kings sometimes shared sleeping chambers with favored courtiers. A shared bed didn't always imply intimacy. Sometimes it simply meant space was precious. Which brings us to manors and castles, where space was less limited, but sleep was still far from private. Lords and ladies slept in grand chambers, yes, but rarely alone. Servants often slept on the floor nearby. Children, bodyguards, and companions might all be in the same room. Even a noble's most luxurious bed was often a shared space. A proper bed in a noble home might include a frame of oak or elm, thick ropes laced to support a feather mattress, and layers of linen sheets, woolen blankets, and embroidered covers. But even then, the room was cold. There were no heaters, just fireplaces, and those didn't warm the entire space. Heavy curtains around the bed weren't just for looks, they kept out drafts, and those curtains, well, they also kept out eyes. For despite all their status, the wealthy had little more privacy than peasants. Walls were thin, floors creaked, and a castle was always full of people. Servants woke early, guards paced the halls, fires needed tending. The night was full of footsteps. In monasteries, sleep followed a different rhythm entirely. Monks lived by the bell. Sleep came in short intervals, a few hours after evening prayer, then up again for midnight vigil, and back to rest before dawn. They slept in long communal dormitories, often on simple straw beds, their robes still on. Even kings and queens did not sleep as soundly as we might think. They rose early, often before sunrise, to attend to matters of state or worship. Royal beds were symbolic, tall, carved, draped in cloth of gold, but beneath the covers the same concerns stirred: warmth, comfort, safety. But perhaps most surprisingly, comfort didn't always follow wealth. A peasant child sleeping in a warm hayloft beside siblings might rest more soundly than a courtier in a cold, echoing stone chamber. Simplicity, it turns out, had its own kind of luxury. Throughout the Middle Ages, ideas about comfort evolved. Slowly, the 13th century saw a rise in soft furnishings among the upper classes. Cushions, pillows, and quilts became symbols of refinement. By the 15th century, even middle-class homes began to invest in better bedding. But no matter the wealth, everyone had to deal with the same universal truths: the cold, the dark, and the unpredictability of sleep. Where you laid your head mattered. Yes, but how you approached sleep, with prayer, routine, or simple gratitude, may have mattered more. So next time you lie down on a memory foam mattress under a fluffy duvet, imagine, just for a moment, what would it feel like to sleep in a hayloft, with the scent of summer grass rising around you, the soft hush of a barn settling into stillness, and nothing but the stars above dot. Would the quiet feel different? Would the darkness feel fuller? And would you sleep more deeply, knowing that rest in any form is its own kind of wealth? Let's drift deeper into the medieval night, not just into the rooms and haylofts where people slept, but into why they chose these places, how they prepared for rest, and what the act of sleeping meant in a world shaped by toil, fear, and faith. While modern sleep often begins with winding down, brushing teeth, changing clothes, maybe dimming the lights. The medieval bedtime was far more tied to rhythm and necessity. Light was precious. Candles were handmade, expensive, and not meant for late-night comfort. Once the sun dipped low, activities slowed, and the darkness signaled one thing clearly. It was time to rest. For most peasants and workers, the nightly routine was short and straightforward. There were no pajamas. One simply loosened the belt or removed heavy outer garments, leaving on a shift or tunic. Washing before bed was rare, especially in colder seasons when water was icy and indoor plumbing non-existent. Sometimes a face or hands might be rinsed in a basin, but a full body wash, that was for feast days or the sick. Bedtime also meant securing the home. Doors were latched or barred with wooden beams. Windows, if present, were often just wooden shutters, closed, against wind or spirits. Ashes from the hearth were raked carefully to preserve embers for the morning. And if you were lucky, someone would toss a few extra twigs onto the fire for a little warmth through the night. Then came the settling, not just of bodies, but of sounds. The chickens in their roosts quieted. The pigs in the corner pen grunted, once or twice before curling into straw. Children snuggled close. Adults whispered final words, and silence returned. But sleep wasn't always straightforward. In fact, medieval people often slept in two separate shifts, known today as first sleep and second sleep. After the day's work, families would retire early, often not long after nightfall. They'd drift into the first sleep, which typically lasted until around midnight. Then people would wake up, not fully, perhaps, but enough to tend to the fire, check on animals, even say prayers. Some would talk quietly, others might think, write, or meditate. Then, after an hour or two, they'd return to bed for the second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This segmented sleep wasn't considered a problem, it was normal. The body, left to natural rhythms, seemed to prefer it. It may have offered a rare moment of calm thoughtfulness in a world otherwise full of noise and obligation. Even the positions people used to sleep varied by need and status. Peasants often curled up on their sides for warmth. In colder months, whole families might huddle together for heat, like a litter of puppies. Shared body heat was not just practical, it was life-saving. In towns, where houses were built close together, nighttime came with the muffled sounds of others nearby, footsteps above, coughing through thin walls, a distant cry from a baby. Beds were narrow, shared, and often tightly packed into attic rooms or under rafters. Those who could afford better beds took their rest more seriously. The noble bed was a piece of craftsmanship, a heavy wooden frame strung with ropes, softened with feather mattresses or stuffed linen pads. Sheets were changed more often in wealthy homes, and many used scented herbs like lavender or rosemary to freshen them. The poor might line their pallets with dried leaves or straw mixed with herbs to keep bugs away. But no matter the class, nighttime wasn't always safe. Fear, both real and imagined, came with the dark. Wolves roamed nearby woods, bandits sometimes, struck after nightfall. And then there were the supernatural concerns, spirits, demons, and omens to protect themselves. People would sometimes pray before sleeping, a habit deeply embedded in daily life. Common medieval bedtime prayers asked for protection through the night, invoking saints, angels, or the Virgin Mary. Some kept protective charms near the bed. Others believed that sleeping with certain objects, like iron knives, might ward of evil children were often told not to sleep on their backs, lest the devil sit on their chest. And in some regions, people refused to sleep with their feet pointed toward the door, the way corpses were laid out. Before burial, even the shape and direction of beds had meaning. Monks slept with heads to the east, toward Jerusalem, in noble homes. Beds were often placed in alcoves or against walls for warmth and to prevent drafts. Curtains weren't just for show, they trapped heat and muffled sounds. And then, of course, there were the communal spaces. Travelers slept in inns, often sharing beds with strangers. Pilgrims slept in churches or barn lofts. In plague years, entire families might sleep in the same room to care for each other, or isolate from others entirely. Comfort wasn't just about soft bedding, it was about security, being close to the fire, near loved ones, behind a barred door. In that way, even the humblest sleeping space could feel sacred. As centuries passed, ideas about sleep shifted. By the late Middle Ages, more households used bed linens. Wooden bedsteads became more common in towns. Sleep began to be associated with health, not just rest. Physicians even gave advice. Open windows if you can. Don't sleep with your mouth open. Avoid sleeping too close to livestock if possible. But for the most part, the sleeping habits of the Middle Ages remained humble. They were practical, rooted in survival. Sleep was not a private luxury. It was a shared necessity. And still, one can't help but wonder, what stories would those haylofts tell? What dreams floated above smoky hearths? What thoughts stirred during that quiet hour between first and second sleep? Let's return one last time to the haylofts, the hearths, and the wooden frames where medieval people laid their weary heads. But now, let's not just ask where they slept. Let's ask what those sleeping spaces meant in a world defined by social class, climate, belief, and survival. We begin, again, with the peasants. Their beds were not really beds at all, at least not in the modern sense. Often, they were little more than sacks stuffed with straw, or a pile of dried grass laid directly on the earthen floor. Some used boards or crates beneath them to keep pests away. And while we may imagine that straw was soft, in truth, it broke down quickly. It was scratchy, filled with dust, and needed to be changed often. Mice nested in it. Fleas thrived in it. Still, this was the reality for most people, and yet there was comfort in that simplicity. A good bed didn't have to be luxurious to offer rest. After 14 hours of labor in the field, pulling weeds or harvesting barley, even a pile of straw felt like a blessing. Sleep wasn't about luxury. It was about escape. However brief, for servants and apprentices in townhouses or castles, their beds might be tucked under staircases, rolled into corners, or even laid out in halls. Privacy was nearly non-existent. A kitchen boy might sleep near the embers for warmth, and be the first to rise before dawn to reignite the fire. A maid might sleep in the same room as the children she cared for, ready to respond to cries in the night. Even in wealthier homes, sleep remained a shared experience. The master and mistress might have a bed of carved oak covered in linen sheets, and woolen blankets with thick curtains drawn around it. But just outside those curtains might be a servant, a scribe, or a child sleeping on a pallet or narrow bench. These arrangements were practical. Heat was conserved, help was nearby, and space was maximized. There's another group, too, that deserves mention: the sick and the old. For them, sleep was harder. Medieval medicine understood that rest helped recovery, but comfort was hard to come by. Fevered bodies lay on straw mats. Broken bones were braced with splints and left to heal in cold corners. Mothers gave birth on wooden beds or, sometimes, simply on cloths spread on the ground. The old, when no longer useful to the household or manor, might be tucked near the fire or moved to outbuildings, left to sleep as best they could, with the crackling of the hearth or the bleating of sheep outside as lullaby. And yet, in monasteries and convents, sleep had a different rhythm altogether. Monks and nuns followed strict schedules, sleeping only as much as their religious rule allowed. The night was interrupted by sacred obligations, matins and lauds, early morning prayers, often at 2 or 3 a.m. Sleep came in short bursts, separated by devotion. Silence was maintained, and sleeping quarters, called dormitories, were often lined with narrow beds or wooden platforms. Each monk had a tiny space, often no more than a cot and a chest. Curtains were rare. Privacy was not the goal. The idea was simple. Sleep should refresh the body, but not distract the soul. The wealthy, of course, had options. By the late medieval period, aristocrats began to design bedchambers, not just for sleep, but for status. Beds were raised higher from the floor, decorated with embroidery, draped in velvets or silks. Some were so tall they required steps to climb into. These rooms were not just for rest, they were symbols of power and prestige. Receiving guests in bed was common. Conversations, meals, even business might take place from within the folds of a grand bed. But these luxurious chambers were rare. For most of Europe's population, nighttime remained cold, dim, and communal. Across these sleeping spaces, from castle towers to farmyard, barns, one common theme remains. People made do. They layered animal skins when blankets were few. They cuddled children not just out of love, but to keep everyone warm. They whispered prayers to ward off bad dreams, or placed rosemary under pillows to keep away lice. Some even slept with dogs for warmth and protection. Night was not just a time of rest. It was a test of endurance, of faith, of how little a person could survive on and still rise to greet the morning. But beyond survival, there's something human, something oddly timeless, in the way medieval people approached sleep. They, like us, cherished comfort when they could get it. They feared the dark. They listened to the soft breathing of a loved one nearby. They dreamt strange dreams, though they may have believed those dreams carried divine messages or warnings. They rose in the night to check the fire, soothe a child, or pray for their souls. Their nights were different, yes, but also, in a way, they were very much the same. We end, then, not with a grand conclusion, but with a quiet question, one that may settle gently on the mind as you drift to sleep. If you lived in that time, in that world of cold floors, shared beds, and silent prayers, where would you have laid your head? And what dreams might have come to you between first sleep and second? Let's go back nearly 1,000 years to a time when the world beyond monastery walls was violent, uncertain, and hard. In cities, kings warred. In villages, peasants toiled. But in the cloistered silence of a monastery, everything ran on a very different rhythm. It wasn't set by sunrise or market bells. It was set by prayer. And prayer, in the medieval church, did not sleep. The average monk's day was carved up by what were known as the divine offices, a cycle of prayer that spanned every 24-hour period. The day began in the deep dark of night, with a bell ringing out across the cloisters long before dawn. That first prayer was matins, and it often started around 2 or 3 a.m. Imagine that, waking up in a stone dormitory, where the only heat came from body warmth, or maybe a flickering torch outside your cell. You'd pull on your habit, coarse wool, never quite warm, and silently make your way down the corridor to the church. No one spoke, no one complained. This was your duty, a sacred interruption in the middle of the night. For these monks, sleep was not a right. It was something to be rationed, controlled. Some monasteries allowed only 4 to 6 hours of sleep each night, split into 2 parts. Others enforced total silence at night, meaning that even groans or whispered prayers had to be stifled. The rule of Saint Benedict, one of the most influential monastic guidelines of the time, shaped how most monks lived and slept. According to his rule, the brothers should rise without delay when the bell was rung for matins. No grumbling, no drowsy turning over in bed, just rise and go. And then there were the beds themselves, or rather, the lack of them. Many monks didn't sleep in individual rooms. Instead, they slept in long dormitories, side by side on hard surfaces, usually wooden planks or thin mattresses of straw. Pillows were rare. Blankets were scratchy. The idea was not to indulge in comfort, but to resist it. Comfort led to temptation. Too much warmth could dull the spirit. Too much privacy could invite sin. But this austere setup didn't mean monks were joyless or unfeeling. Some monasteries, especially in colder climates, did allow a bit of leniency. Thicker blankets in winter, perhaps, or a wool cap at night. There are even records of monks requesting extra straw for their mattresses during illness or old age. And while the night was long and fragmented, it wasn't entirely without rest. After matins sometimes lasting over an hour, the monks would often return to bed for a short second sleep. Then, just before dawn, another bell rang, this time for lauds, the prayer welcoming the light of morning. Sleep, in this world, became an act of obedience. Waking in the cold darkness became a habit, not a punishment, but a path to discipline. And yet, beyond the discomfort, there was also a kind of strange peace in the deep silence of the night church. Beneath vaulted ceilings and stone walls, the monks sang prayers that echoed like ancient lullabies. Psalms chanted in Latin, candles flickering, the steady rhythm of devotion offering a kind of comfort that went beyond warm blankets or soft beds. They were not trying to sleep like kings. They were trying to sleep like saints. Interestingly, this fractured early night and second night sleep pattern wasn't limited to monasteries. There's strong evidence that many people across medieval Europe, including peasants, followed a segmented sleep schedule. People would go to bed shortly after nightfall, wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night, then return to sleep until dawn. But in monasteries, this pattern was formalized, ritualized, and governed by the relentless bell. That bell was more than just a signal. It was a symbol. It told monks when to rise, when to work, when to eat, and when to rest. Monks didn't own clocks. They didn't need them. Time belonged to the community and to God. If the bell rang at midnight, you rose. If it rang at dawn, you prayed. Time wasn't yours, it was sacred. And in some places, one monk was assigned the task of watching the stars, literally standing outside in the dark to monitor the skies and judge when to ring the bell. He was called the horologer, or the timekeeper. In a sense, he traded his sleep entirely so that others could follow theirs. Imagine being that monk, wrapped in a cloak against the frost, watching the stars inch across the sky, holding the rope of the bell in hand. waiting for the moment when all the others would stir in their straw beds, rise without a word, and shuffle into the dimly lit church. It's strange to think how far removed this all feels from our modern world, where sleep is often chased and rarely caught, where screens glow into the night and alarm clocks jar us awake. And yet, there's something about that silent, bell-marked night that feels ... grounding ... not comfortable, but calm, and in that calm there may have been peace, a kind of peace, born not of luxury, but of rhythm and purpose. So, as we end this first section, here's something to ponder gently as you drift. If your night was broken by bells, prayers, and cold stone floors, would you still sleep peacefully? Or would you find a different kind of rest? One that has nothing to do with softness and everything to do with silence? While the rest of medieval Europe drifted in and out of sleep, monks lived by the clock, not the sun or seasons, but the toll of sacred bells. In section 1, we explored how the monastic rhythm revolved around divinely scheduled prayers and duties, but now, let's go deeper into how that rhythm physically shaped the way monks slept, woke, worked, and sometimes struggled. The idea of sleep in a medieval monastery was never one of deep, uninterrupted slumber. It was more like sleep woven around prayer. A typical Benedictine monk might go to bed shortly after sunset, but this wasn't a final rest. Depending on the monastery's specific rule and location, he could be woken 2 or even 3 more times through the night. The first interruption usually came sometime around midnight, for matins, the longest and most solemn of the night prayers. In the dark stone-cold dormitory, monks would rise from their straw-stuffed pallets, pull on their habits, and make their way down the narrow corridor. No one spoke. That silence was deliberate. Every movement was done with purpose, without disturbing the peace or their fellow monks' fragile rest. They filed into the chapel, sometimes barefoot, especially in older monasteries where shoes were seen as an indulgence. Matins could last over an hour, and the cold stone floors didn't help ease anyone back to sleep afterward. Some monks would head straight back to their pallets. Others, too chilled or too alert, might read scripture or pray silently until the next bell called again, usually just before dawn. For lords, this pattern meant that monastic sleep wasn't just short, it was segmented. Monks often only got 3 or 4 hours at a time, and even that was considered a blessing. The rule of Saint Benedict didn't mention comfort. It prized discipline, spiritual awareness, and routine over rest. Tiredness was seen as a sacrifice. But how did this lifestyle affect them? Interestingly, some modern researchers believe that monks may have naturally fallen into what we now call biphasic sleep, 2 separate periods of rest during a 24-hour cycle. In fact, this may have been common even outside monasteries. Some peasants, too, would have a first sleep after sundown, then wake for an hour or 2 before returning to a second sleep closer to dawn. But for monks, this pattern wasn't voluntary. It was built into the walls around them, and those walls told their own story. Most dormitories were built above the cloister, lined with narrow beds or even shared sleeping spaces, separated by thin partitions or nothing at all. No pillows, no personal touches. Some monasteries allowed monks to sleep in their robes, so they wouldn't be tempted by the comfort of soft linens or the luxury of undressing. These were not just beds. They were training grounds for humility and endurance. Then there was the bell. The sound of the bell wasn't just an alarm clock. It was sacred. In some monasteries, a night porter or an assigned bell monk would rise early to ring the bell by hand. He might walk quietly past the dormitory, pulling on a long cord tied to the bell high in the tower. The sound would echo across stone and straw alike, stirring sleepers from their dreams and gently nudging them into obedience. The bell governed everything, not just prayers and meals, but when to start working, when to stop, when to think, and when to sleep or try to. In fact, sleep was only tolerated as long as it didn't interfere with a monk's spiritual alertness. Dozing during prayer was a problem, falling asleep in the chapel. That might earn a quiet scolding, or even a penance. Still, some monks found ways to cope. It's believed that older monks, or those with frail health, were sometimes allowed to rest in a warming room, especially in colder climates. This room was one of the few places in a monastery with a fire, a luxury in stone-walled silence. Here monks might read or sit quietly in warmth between prayers. The warmth, though, wasn't just physical, it was psychological. For a few moments, it reminded them of something softer, something more human. Despite the rigors, many monks lived long lives, healthier, on average, than most peasants. Their diets were plain but clean, and their routines, while hard, were stable. Over time, the monastic lifestyle actually became a sort of sanctuary, especially during the turbulent centuries of war, famine, and disease. Inside the monastery, there was order, even if it meant being woken every few hours by a bell in the night. What's interesting is how this deeply structured routine may have influenced timekeeping across Europe. Before mechanical clocks, monasteries used water clocks or candle clocks to track the hours of prayer. In time, monastic schedules helped inspire the first clock towers, built to ring bells automatically, marking canonical hours, not just for monks, but for surrounding towns. So, in a quiet way, monks didn't just shape how people thought about sleep. They shaped how people thought about time, their discipline, their silent suffering, and their midnight rises gave us something lasting, a structured sense of the day and night, and perhaps even the first organized sense of waking hours. And yet, behind those stone walls, the question lingers. What did it feel like to live that way? Year after year, knowing the bell could break your sleep at any hour. In the still hush of medieval darkness, the bell called again. This was the final portion of the monastic night, the last stretch before daylight. After Lauds, the dawn prayer, monks would stay awake. Sleep was over. The morning tasks began in silence, sweeping the cloisters, tending the herb garden, reading scripture, copying texts by candlelight, or preparing for Mass. For some, this quiet period was their favorite, not because they were well rested, but because it felt peaceful, purposeful. For most monks, this was simply life. The idea of a long, uninterrupted night of sleep, wrapped in warmth and silence, belonged to another world, perhaps one of childhood, or even sin. To choose comfort over prayer was, in the eyes of many orders, to choose the self over the divine, yet monks were human. And sleep deprivation, over time, left its mark. Medieval monastic texts occasionally mention fatigued monks, nodding off during readings or struggling to stay awake through matines. Some abbots, recognizing this, allowed for changes to the schedule during harsh winters or in regions where darkness stretched longer. Others, more strict, insisted that such weakness be offered up as penance, a test of devotion. The rule of Saint Benedict did not ignore the body entirely. It allowed for short naps during the day, especially in summer months when nights were shorter. This rest, known as meridian sleep, could last up to an hour after the midday meal. Monks would return to their pallets or even nap in the warming room, provided they maintained silence and remained alone. These short bursts of sleep helped make up for the interruptions of the night, forming a patchwork of rest rather than a solid block. Some monasteries even had a designated sleep master, someone responsible for ensuring monks followed the sleeping rules, didn't oversleep, or didn't doze off where they shouldn't. He might gently nudge a sleepy monk awake or quietly signal him to move if he'd collapsed in the cloister. Out of sheer exhaustion, despite all this discipline, sleep was never demonized. It was simply managed. In fact, there was a deep spiritual significance attached to it. Monks often wrote about sleep as a metaphor representing death or spiritual unawareness. Waking from sleep, then, symbolized awakening into divine truth. The bell, that ever-present sound in a monk's life, wasn't just an alarm, it was a spiritual summons. A reminder that even sleep could not dull the call of God. Some monasteries placed inscriptions above dormitory doors, Latin phrases like dormientes, surgite, orate, you who sleep, arise and pray. This constant weaving of sleep and spirituality made rest feel less like a bodily function and more like a pause in sacred duty. Outside the monastery walls, people began to notice. Monks were known for their strange habits, especially their odd hours. Travelers staying near monasteries sometimes wrote of hearing bells at night and seeing robed figures walking the halls in candlelight. For many peasants, monks existed in a different world entirely, one where time, sleep, hunger, and even weather seemed to bow to the rhythm of ritual. But gradually, the structure of monastic timekeeping began to influence the outside world. Towns near monasteries began organizing their day around the sound of monastic bells. Markets opened after prime. Work ceased at vespers. Even peasants began to think of time in terms of canonical hours, a shift from seasonal awareness to fixed schedules. This was a quiet but powerful legacy of monastic life, the standardization of time. Later, as mechanical clocks spread across Europe, many were first installed in monasteries, not for convenience, but to ensure prayer times were observed precisely. These clocks eventually migrated to town halls and city squares, but they carried with them a monastic soul, bells that divided the day into duties, breaks, and silence. It's easy to forget that our modern concept of hours and minutes, the structured slicing of time, was born in candlelit dormitories and whispered corridors, where monks rose in the dark because a bell told them it was time to pray. As for the monks themselves, their resilience was remarkable. Despite poor sleep, minimal comfort, and punishing routines, many lived well into their 60s or 70s, a notable age for the time. Some attributed this to clean living, others to divine favor. But perhaps it was also the quiet consistency of their world, the predictability of it all. Even if sleep came in fragments, life itself followed a rhythm, and rhythm has its own kind of peace. There were, of course, those who left monastic life. Some monks eventually chose a more flexible religious path, or became secular priests. Others, after years of cloistered silence, simply longed for a life where sleep was not so measured. But those who stayed often described their lives with surprising contentment. Not joy, exactly, but a deep sense of order, and in the end, maybe that's what the bell gave them. Not rest, not ease, but a place in time, a way to anchor themselves, even as the world outside changed, burned, and rebuilt. The bell kept tolling. It tolled during plagues, during invasions, during famine and reform. It tolled while kings rose and fell, while borders shifted, while the outside world chased sleep as best it could. Inside, the monks rose at its call, not always willingly, not always refreshed, but always faithfully. And so, when we imagine the quiet nights of the Dark Ages, we might picture peasants snoring on straw, nobles dreaming in feather beds, but somewhere in a cold stone monastery, a monk was stirring, the bell was ringing, and he was already on his feet. Imagine a village with no walls, no real protection, just a handful of huts, a crude watchtower, and a well-worn path running between the fields and the woods. It's night in the year 876, and sleep does not come easy. This is the edge of the frontier, somewhere in the unstable borders between Saxon England and the Danelaw, the land seized and held by Viking settlers. For the peasants in these fringe communities, night was not a time of rest. It was a time of risk, because raiders didn't announce their arrival in daylight. They came when the fires had burned low, when livestock were penned up, when doors were barred and people dreamed, or tried to. The village itself might consist of 20 or 30 souls, farmers, a blacksmith, maybe a reeve who reported to the local thane. The homes were simple, wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, packed earth floors. Beds, if they existed, were piles of straw shared by entire families, children, dogs, and sometimes even chickens, all bundled together. Sleep, under these conditions, was noisy, itchy, and crowded. But worse than the discomfort was the fear. Everyone knew someone who had fled a burning village. Stories drifted from market towns, monks slaughtered, barns torched, women taken, children gone. Viking raids weren't constant, but they were frequent enough that most border villages developed a kind of nighttime discipline. One of the most important figures was the night watcher, often an older boy or an insomniac farmer, someone trusted to stay awake and walk the perimeter, usually with a horn. If they saw movement on the tree line, if a dog barked too long, if the wind shifted in that eerie way it sometimes did, they would raise the alarm. This meant running to the central fire pit, blowing the horn, yelling into the dark until every hut was lit from within and every man held something heavy in his hand, a hoe, an axe, even a pitchfork. Villagers practiced what to do if attacked, where to run, how to hide, who would lead the children into the woods. Some even kept small bug-out bundles under their bedding, a cloak, a hunk of bread, a small knife. Nothing fancy, just what could be carried if the flames got too close and escape became the only option. Of course, not all dangers came from across the sea. Bandits, rival lords, and rogue mercenaries posed threats as well. During periods of civil war or famine, even neighbors might turn on each other. Frontier villagers learned to sleep lightly, waking at the snap of a twig or the whinny of a restless horse. Entire families sometimes slept in shifts, taking turns staying awake, a practice that actually continued for centuries in war-torn areas. This segmented sleep, once believed to be unnatural, was often practical. People would sleep a few hours, wake to stoke the fire or check the animals, then go back to sleep again if they could. It wasn't restful, but it was normal. Church bells were rare in small hamlets, but people still marked time loosely. The dark before moonset, the second rooster call. When the ash turned cold, these were the sleepy clocks of the medieval poor. There was no clear bedtime. You went to sleep when your body gave in, or when the watch said it was quiet enough. And yet, even with all this anxiety, people managed to sleep, not deeply, not comfortably, but enough to survive. Enough to plant in the morning, to milk goats, to bake, to live. In some ways, the lack of comfort helped. There were no distractions, no books, no lanterns, no late-night snacking. Once the fire dimmed and the village quieted, the human body did what it has always done. It slowed. Even fear could only last so long before exhaustion took over. Still, there were nights that broke the pattern, when the clouds were too thick to see the moon, when the dogs growled without barking, when the horses stamped and refused water. These were signs, old signs, passed down in whispers that something was coming. Whether it was wolves, raiders, or worse, no one waited to find out. On such nights, villagers might sleep dressed, with shoes on, with tools by their side. Mothers tucked their children in more tightly, told them not to ask questions if they were shaken awake. Fathers might sleep by the door. It was a way of life that left little room for peace, but plenty of room for readiness. Even festivals and holy days didn't bring true rest. A village celebrating Candlemas or Pentecost might hang garlands and drink ale, but the watch never stopped. The bell, if they had one, was still tested. The fire still fed. The children still hushed at the sound of distant hooves. To be a peasant on the edge of a raid zone was to live in constant half-preparedness, and this shaped more than sleep. It shaped how people loved, parented, and aged. Marriages were practical. Childhood was short. Old age, if reached, was quiet and grateful, and yet there was community, because when safety is uncertain, people cling to one another. A neighbor's cough in the night was noticed. A missing dog stirred questions. The bond between villagers was not just social, it was survival. They sang lullabies with one ear to the forest. They carved prayers into doorframes. They slept in haylofts, basements, or not at all. But they endured, always listening for the sound that would wake them, always wondering if this would be the night the war drums came. The morning after a tense night on the frontier was never quite peaceful. It wasn't celebration, it was more like relief, worn thin. If the horn hadn't sounded, if no one had disappeared, if the livestock was still penned and the embers in the hearth still warm, then it had been a good night. But even good nights left their mark in villages that lived with the threat of sudden attack. Sleep wasn't just physical, it was collective. How well you slept depended on how safe everyone else was. If your neighbor's hut caught fire, it could spread. If the reeve was careless, people might die. So villagers developed a deeply interdependent rhythm, not just for work, but for rest, and over time they built habits of quiet vigilance. Certain behaviors were passed down like inherited tools. Never fully undress for sleep. Keep water near the door. Don't stack firewood against the side of the house. Raiders could use it to climb. Children were trained young. If you hear the horn, grab the bundle and follow the adult. Don't cry. Don't stop. Just move. Some families had escape holes, a gap at the back of the hut covered with straw, or firewood that could be kicked through in seconds. Others slept in buried pits, semi-dugouts, under the floorboards, or behind the animal pens, reinforced with planks. In some settlements, communal shelters were built, simple, sunken huts where families could crowd together during a raid. Wasn't comfortable, but it was strategic misery, the kind you endured to stay alive. One of the reasons this way of life persisted was because the fear wasn't constant. It was seasonal. Summer and early autumn were the worst. Viking. Ships could travel farther, rivers ran high, and crops were nearly ready, ripe targets. A village might go an entire winter without hearing so much as a distant horn, and then lose everything in a single hot August night. This pattern led to a strange cycle: spring repairs, summer readiness, autumn dread, winter anxiety. Rest came, only in brief stretches, and even then, not without suspicion. Those who lived near larger estates or castles had slightly more protection. If a local lord took responsibility for defense, he might build a matten bailey, a wooden fortress, on a hill surrounded by a ditch and palisade. In times of trouble, villagers could run to it, but space was limited, and lords expected loyalty and labor in exchange for this privilege. For the common folk, this meant growing the lord's grain, giving up part of their own harvest, or serving as guards. Some villages even rotated watch duties for the lord's estate. Their reward was the hope of safety in crisis. Still, not all danger came from outsiders. The 9th and 10th centuries were chaotic times in Europe. After empire fractured, power shifted constantly. In Britain, France, and the Germanic states, small lords often fought over borders, taxes, or inheritance rights. Sometimes they used peasant villages as leverage, burning fields, taking hostages, or seizing livestock. It wasn't personal, just politics, and it meant that even villages far from the sea weren't truly safe. This led to the rise of a quiet resistance. Peasants learned to bury valuables, hide food stores, or mislead passing soldiers. Some even built dummy granaries, empty sheds meant to be looted first. If all went well, the real food would remain untouched, hidden in pits or woven baskets, hung in trees, and of course, they hid themselves, not just from raids, but from records. Avoiding a census, misleading a tax collector, or feigning fewer livestock was a survival tactic. The less a village was known, the safer it might be. Sleep, in this context, was always tentative. A fire that burned too high at night might signal wealth and attract attention. A dog that barked too often might be killed by its own villagers. Just to prevent discovery, even joy was sometimes stifled. No loud singing, no loud celebrations, not after sunset, and yet humans adapt. They always do. Over time, villagers developed a kind of emotional muscle memory, knowing when to rest, when to run, and when to simply endure. Parents created bedtime stories that were equal parts comfort and caution. The Owl King hears crying, one tale went, and carries noisy children into the woods. Another said, if you lie still and breathe slow, you become invisible to danger. Were these superstitions? Sure, but they served a purpose, helping children sleep in a world that was not made for comfort. Despite everything, people found small rituals of peace. Some placed sprigs of herbs under their straw mattresses, lavender, if it was available, or rue to ward off spirits. Others chalked protective runes on their doors, or whispered Latin prayers they half remembered from passing. Monks' sleep was sacred because it was rare. When it came, it was cherished among adults. There was an unspoken understanding that a missed night of sleep was not weakness, it was service. If your neighbor stayed up through the stormy night, listening for hoofbeats, you let him rest. The next day, if an old woman woke to stoke the fire and noticed a light on the ridge, she became a hero, if quietly so. There were no medals, no written records, but in these nameless frontier villages, the people who watched while others slept were remembered in stories. Long after they were gone, some frontier communities even created shared night calendars, informal systems where different families took turns staying half awake. It wasn't foolproof, but it meant the burden didn't fall only on the anxious, the elderly, or the light sleepers. And what's most remarkable is that, through all of this, life continued. Babies were born. Bread was baked. Songs were hummed as oxen turned the soil. In a place where sleep was shallow and danger ever near, people still found a way to live as if peace were possible. Even the act of laying down at all, of closing one's eyes in the dark, became a kind of rebellion, a small claim to normalcy, in a world that was anything but, because eventually, even in the most fearful villages, there came a night when the dogs didn't bark, when the sky stayed clear, when the fire crackled softly, and the straw didn't itch too badly, and for just a little while they slept. There comes a point in any long tension, even the fear of nightly raids, when people stop noticing it. Not because it disappears, but because the human body and mind are stubbornly adaptable by the late Dark Ages. Villagers who lived near frontier zones in the borderlands of England and Wales, Normandy, Saxony, or southern Italy had settled into a rhythm that was not quite peace and not quite war. It was endurance. A rhythm of shallow sleep, swift waking, and the soft rustle of feet on packed earth when the horn sounded in the dark dot in those final hours of the night, the most dangerous time. When the body is weakest and the sky just begins to pale, you could find whole families sitting quietly on the edge of their straw mats, listening, waiting, not panicked, not restless, just present. That peculiar calm that only centuries of danger could teach, and yet somehow people found meaning in that stillness. In many villages, stories from old raids became oral tradition, part warning, part ritual. An old man might recall how he saved 3 children by hiding them in a dry well. A woman might speak of the night her father died, standing in the doorway, axe in hand. These tales were shared not just to remember, but to prepare. And preparation, in the end, was what turned survival into strength. Children learned to spot trouble long before it came. They watched the birds in the hedgerows. If the sparrows fled early, something might be stirring. They learned the scent of distant fire, the slight rattle of dry leaves that meant someone was moving outside the path. These weren't tricks. They were skills passed down from generations who had survived. Even the act of building homes changed. Walls grew thicker, door latches stronger. Roofs were woven tighter to resist flaming arrows. Some families built false walls behind their beds, shallow crawl spaces where the youngest could hide. A few frontier villages even constructed underground sleeping quarters beneath barns, disguised with dung or hay to mask their scent and sound. In some regions, especially near forests or rivers, people began sleeping in shifts year-round, not just during the high-risk seasons. While one person dozed, another stayed up tending the fire, checking the horizon, listening to the wind. It became almost spiritual, a nightly offering of wakefulness so others might rest. Among these watchers, some developed strange habits. A few whispered prayers to forgotten gods. Others counted stars or spoke softly to the animals, not because they expected a reply, but because silence could grow too heavy. They were guardians, in the most ordinary sense, uncelebrated, unremembered, but entirely essential, and slowly, over decades, the threat of raids began to fade, not all at once, but like mist lifting in patches. Kings consolidated power. Lords built stronger keeps. roads became safer. And with that safety, sleep changed. Families began to let their children sleep more deeply. Doors were bolted with less urgency. Fires were allowed to die out at night. The fear did not vanish, but it lessened. In some villages, entire years passed without an attack. A miracle, really. But what surprised many was that people didn't sleep better right away. The old habits remained. People still lay lightly on their mats, ears tuned to silence. Still crept to the door before dawn, just to glance out. It took a generation, maybe two, before deep, careless sleep returned. And yet, even when it did, something of the old world remained in the new. Some families kept watching traditions, out of custom. "It's just how we've always done it," they'd say. Children would be taught to listen for owls or watch the flame of the hearth for strange flickers. It wasn't about fear anymore. It was about memory. Even today, in some rural areas of Europe, you'll find traces of these habits. Bells hung above barn doors to warn of movement. Small bowls of salt near windows to keep out danger. Houses built with narrow passageways, not for beauty, but for tactical sleep. The war drums may have quieted, but the people who lived beneath them remembered. And those memories of half-slept nights, of soft warnings in the dark, of mothers holding their children tighter when the wind blew from the wrong direction, became the bones of community. Because sleeping on the edge of a raid didn't just build resilience, it built togetherness. People learned that survival wasn't about being the strongest, it was about being there for each other. About knowing who would share their shelter, who would listen for danger, who would lend a hand without needing to be asked. The strongest part of any medieval village wasn't its palisade, its weapons, or even its able-bodied fighters. It was the shared knowledge, the unspoken trust that someone would always be awake, just in case. In the end, the story of sleep in these frontier towns isn't about fear. It's about how fear was faced quietly, patiently, together, and so the villagers slept, not deeply, not without worry, but they slept enough to grow barley, enough to raise children, enough to survive, and perhaps enough to dream of a quieter world, where war drums were nothing but distant echoes, and sleep came without cost.